Thanks for downloading the Marcus Pye podcast.
Welcome to the Marcus Pye podcast on historicracingnews.com. We're here in essentially the guest studio at Thruxton Circuit, which is one of the historicracingnews.com hubs in this country. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined in the studio by one of my oldest friends in racing, Mike Wilds. He's been round the block a few times in racing cars and in aircraft, and to celebrate his birthday, we're not going to let on which one it is. Mike, welcome, and a familiar territory to you, Thruxton.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Yes, one of my all-time favourite circuits. I love fast racetracks, and they don't really get any faster than Thruxton. Started racing here many, many years ago, as you know, and love the place to bits. And thank you very much for inviting me here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. I mean, when I first came here to Thruxton in '73, you were here in your Formula 3 car, the Dempster Developments March 733, run by our old friend Colin Bennett. Greetings to Colin. He's not been so well recently, but I'm glad he's on the mend.
Absolutely.
And your racing goes back such a long way, which is brilliant. And I think that there's a couple of types of racing driver for me. There's the type who goes out there and ends up being a multiple world champion, such as Mr. Hamilton, whose birthday it is today and shares yours. But to me, there's the real racing driver, the likes of Mike Wilds, who's done it all. And every year looks forward to what is the next challenge in the paddock. The guys who become world champions, they kind of stop fairly soon after that, don't they?
Yes, well, they probably have a bigger bank balance than mine now.
That's the clue.
Yes, I think it boils down really to one word. I have a passion for what I do. I have an absolute passion for motorsport. It's been my life for the whole of my life, and it was wonderful for me to struggle to actually get started with no money, living in a little flat in Chiswick, and then, albeit uncompetitively, to sit on the grid of a Grand Prix, which was my ultimate ambition. And how many people can go through that process and achieve their ultimate ambition? I would love to have stayed there, but I probably wasn't good enough to stay there. But at least I got there, and I'm very proud of myself, if I may say that I actually got there.
And the problem really is that, I mean, when you're scratching around without a budget, with a few loyal supporters chipping in a few quid here and there, you're inevitably going to end up at the scrag end of the grid. When the teams are struggling, and we'll get to that in a while. But I mean, you started out on the club racing route, only kind of probably one or two drivers a generation these days from Britain will get to Formula One. But drivers did get promoted on merit. They get asked to step up in the days when you were climbing that ladder. I mean, you're probably the only person in the world to have raced a DRW and gone on to be a Formula One driver.
Yes, a lovely BMW. DRW. I've got a BMW now, that's probably why.
David Warwick, wasn't he the guy?
Yes, built in Highgate in North London. I had his very first one, the Mark 1, and I got involved with motorcars through my father, who had a passion for just fiddling with motorcars. He was a professional photographer,
and I have to say, he was an absolutely lovely guy. It was always a joy to be in the Wilds area of the pits or the paddock, because Mr. Wilds Senior was just a delight.
That's very kind. He had a passion for cars, so I got my passion for motorcars from my father, and I love taking photographs. So both his passions transferred to me. My brother, Johnny, bless his heart, had a passion for motorcycles. So he went and raced motorcycles, and I went to watch him. And I think that's where I got my passion for racing, was from my brother. But it went the four-wheel route rather than the two-wheel route.
It's a tad safer, isn't it?
Possibly. He never really got hurt too badly, bless his heart, but I seem to have got hurt quite badly in racing cars over the years, so I'm not too sure about that. But the DRW was wonderful. I went to London Special Builders Group 750 Motor Club meetings, and you'd have Eric Broadley there, and who was about to start Lola cars. Wonderful for me to sit there and listen to these people talk about how they were building racing cars. I didn't have the expertise to do that, but luckily I met a man called Lou Bergonzi, who owned a DRW Mark I with a little side valve 1172 engine, Ford engine, and he wanted to sell it. I had no money whatsoever. I had been working as a young man. I got a Saturday job at the Checkered Flag in Chiswick, washing their cars. And I started to work in clubs and bars when I was old enough to save money because I wanted to try and buy a racing car.
Not Ian Flux style clubs and bars?
No.
Just so we clear that one up.
Yes, we
Your
won't go
future
there,
teammate.
really. Yes. And I had enough money for a deposit on a car, and Lou wanted £280, including the trailer for the car, and I said I'd have it, and then went home to my mother and father to say, I want to buy this car, I have enough money possibly for a deposit. And my mother straight away, bless her heart, said, I'll stand guarantor for a loan for you. So she did that, and one very, very foggy winter's evening in 1964, Lou brought the car on the trailer and parked it outside the flat where I used to live, and there it stayed because I had no money to do anything else. I didn't have a car to tow it with. And my father and I used to go down, we put a tarpaulin over it, we used to start it up occasionally, and it sat there until the spring of 1965, and nobody ever touched it. It wouldn't be there the following morning now. I had my first race with it after I saved up more money at the 750 Motor Club meeting in May 1965 at Snetterton, and my life changed forever.
Amazing stuff. I mean, those little cars, 1172 Formula was a hotbed of special building, wasn't it? You had the fixed Ford engine, if you like, and so many great designers came up through that arena, and the 750 Formula as well, which at that point had Austin 7 engines and went on to the Reliance. But
yes,
yeah, you were in the senior class.
Absolutely. In fact, one of my best friends now, in fact, we own a boat together. Nigel Bennett, who went on to be a fantastic race car designer. We also worked together at Firestone. He was a 750 Motor Club member, and so much talent came through that motor club. It was a tremendous start for us
Colin
all.
Chapman, Arthur Mallock, Mike Pilbeam, Tony Southgate, they were all there doing it, weren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And
Brian Hart.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is amazing. But I mean, you had a win in that 65 season, didn't you?
Yeah, it was tremendous. I had no idea what I was doing at Snetterton at all. People were telling me where to sign on, where to go to scrutineering, listen for a paddock announcement that you'll have to go out for practice, and I had no idea really. And
so you'd not been going to racing as a spectator?
I did. I did go with the Checkered Flag with their Formula Junior team, but really just to clean the cars.
To work rather than actually observe what was going on in the big scene.
That was with Ross Grenville. And Roy Pike. And that's where I totally fell head over heels with motor racing. But I didn't have any clue about driving a car on a racetrack. And I followed people in practice and picked up some idea of what they were doing, and I didn't go off, and I started fairly well down the grid. But for some reason, when the man raised this Union Jack to start the race, I gave it some revs and dropped the clutch. And I seemed to overtake a few people, and on the way down to the first corner, which I think is Rich's at Snetterton, there was nobody in front of me, and it was really quite weird. So I thought I'd done something wrong, so I don't know why I didn't use the rear view mirror, but I looked round.
Probably was missing, couldn't afford that bit.
I looked round and I looked over my shoulder, and of course I'd put the brakes on by this time, and lots of cars just kept going past me again. But I eventually ended up in third place, which was amazing, and I've got this tiny little egg cup trophy at home from that first ever race.
Which you're probably as proud of as any in your
oh my God, yes,
in
absolutely
your CV.
right. Yeah, and then I saved up a bit more money, went to Silverstone, and I tested the car when I bought it off Lou Bergonzi. I tested it on the club circuit at Silverstone, so I knew it.
Oh,
and I finished second. And luckily, the third round of the 1172 championship was at Silverstone again, and I won that one, which was absolutely amazing. I think my mum and dad cried.
Fantastic. Well, the DRW did you really well for about 3 or 4 seasons, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. It did. It was a wonderful little car.
Is the book ever coming out about DRWs, which has been in preparation for some years?
I did talk to them about it some time ago, so hopefully it will, because it was a lovely little car. I did lend it to a friend of mine, my sadly missed friend Keith Norman, who was racing a Terrier 1172 at the time. He was a lovely guy, shared my passion for motorsport. He could have been a professional racing driver. He really was very, very good, and he was very good at preparing his cars. He had a problem with the Terrier, and he was leading the championship. So I said, okay, I'll forego a race, and you can drive my DRW. He drove it, got some points, and gave it back to me afterwards and said it was possibly the worst handling car he'd ever driven in his life. And I read his book. In fact, I wrote the foreword to his book, The Last Lap, before he died, bless him. And in the book, he said his estimation of me as a driver went up. He couldn't really understand how I could make the DRW go so quickly with it handling so badly.
And does that car still exist?
I don't know. I sold it to a gentleman called Derek Bowley, and I would love to buy it back. So if there's anybody who's got it, please, I'd love to buy it back.
It won't be a long queue, but Mike's at the head of it, my sense. So really after that, you went on to have a kind of bit of a trial outing in one of the Bottoms family's Vixens, the F4 Vixen.
Yes, I did. In fact, it was a car owned by a guy called Tony Somerson, and I had to sell the DRW eventually to pay off the debts, because I did have a bad accident in the car at Brands Hatch in 1966, and I was in hospital for a long time. We didn't wear seatbelts, obviously, in those days, and it inverted, and I snapped my pelvis and was very, very badly hurt. Didn't wake up for a week or two. And
you missed the World Cup final.
I was out in time for that. It was quite funny, really, because I was taken to Dartford Hospital. I was in traction, and my father, bless his heart, started to rebuild the car. And a mate of mine, Tiny Littler, who had a body shop in South London, repaired the chassis for me. And my father used to drag the car and the trailer behind my mum's Morris Minor 1000 all the way to West Hill Hospital in Dartford. And if he parked it in a particular place in the car park, I could see it across the ward through the window. I could see the car and its progress of rebuild, which was really lovely of him. Every week or two he would bring it up to show me, and I couldn't wait to get out to get driving the car again. But eventually I had to sell it to pay off all the debts that I had on the rebuild of the car. And that's when I started just going around talking to people that I'd met, one of which was John Cavell, who is still one of my very bestest friends. I eventually drove one of John's VB4 Vixens, and
they had imp engines, didn't they?
Yes, Hillman imp, Ian Carter tuned imp engines.
Yeah, legend. And
they were great little cars. So I started to race
pretty
those.
Too.
Yeah, very pretty, very dangerous if you had an accident. Yeah. They weren't very strong, but
and they were made by Alec Bottoms, though, weren't they?
Yes, over in Cheshunt somewhere.
Was he son of Alf Bottoms, who was a 500 racer?
Do you know? I don't know.
There aren't many bottoms about, are there?
Oh, there are lots of bottoms about.
So just talking about that big accident that you had, Mike, that as your first big accident, did it change anything for you?
No, not at all.
No.
It seemed to... the only thought I had was I wanted to get back in the car. It really wasn't my... There was a very nice man called Pete Lokman who had a Regio, and I was trying to overtake him at Brands Paddock Bend, and he spun, and I made the wrong decision. I thought he was going to spin to the infield, so I stayed flat thinking, great, I've got the lead now. But he held the slide and it came backwards and pushed me off onto the dirt. And in those days, the banking, it had to be the MSA or the RAC, I suppose, in those days. The banking had to be 6 feet from the bottom to the top for spectator safety. But they didn't want to build up the bank, so they dug a ditch. So it was 6 feet from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the bank. And of course, as soon as I went on the grass, which was wet, I slid down into the ditch. The car dug in, it somersaulted, and as I say, luckily I hit and broke my nose on the dashboard, which turned the ignition, the fuel pump and everything off. So as it was going over, snapping my pelvis and my arms and ribs and whatever else, I was unconscious, so I was very, very flexible. Otherwise, I think it could have been quite a fatal accident.
And obviously, it wasn't your fault. So
no,
therefore,
so
that changes
yes,
it, doesn't it?
And I think that's been my. I don't know what the word is, but
in the get-out clause.
Yes, I mean I have made mistakes, as all racing drivers do, but my really major accidents have always been either a mechanical failure, not because I've made a really glaring error and broken my legs and so on. If that had been the case, possibly I'd have thought, right, well, this obviously is not the profession for me because I'm making too many mistakes. As I say, we all make mistakes, and I've made some glaring ones, but overall, I think I've been okay.
Mm. But you were also working for Firestone, weren't you? As a kind of I think observer. I think we got to the conclusion earlier on, rather than a technician or an engineer.
Yes.
Or whatever.
I was working. I eventually ended up working at the Checkered Flag because I wanted to be close to motor racing, to try and meet people, to see how I could progress my ambitions.
Primitive networking.
to be a racing driver. But it wasn't really working. I was never going to get a drive in anything from the Checkered Flag. So I wanted to get involved in the international side of motorsport and meet people who might be able to help me in the future. Somebody said, why don't you go as a test driver for Firestone Tyre and Rubber Company in Brentford, which was just down the road from Chiswick. I applied and they had no vacancies, but they said they had a vacancy in the export department doing paperwork. But they did say if we ever came up with a job available in the test department or the race tyre division, we would definitely give you an opportunity. And I believed them. And I went and I worked behind a desk for 12 months or so. And I'd bought the DRW at this stage. And one day I was called into the boss's office and he said, we have a position available in the European race division for an operations manager. Now I had no idea at all, but bless their hearts, they gave me the opportunity to go and be operations manager of this European race tyre division. I had to coordinate the production of race tyres to Grand Prix, to the World Sports Car Championship for Porsche, Ford, Ferrari, Surtees, and what have you. And I bluffed my way through and started to understand the business, and I stayed there until 1972, from the mid-1960s. And it was a wonderful job. And when they had if my production didn't finish on time for certain races, I would drive the truck myself to Le Mans or wherever and take the last batch of tyres. And while I was there, they'd say, well, you work, you go and take tyre temperatures on the Porsche 917s or the Ferrari or whatever. And it was magic. What a magic time for me.
Extraordinary era, and you were there at the cutting face.
Absolutely. And I remember when Jackie Ickx was driving the GT40. I think, was it Le Mans in '69 when Hans Hermann was in the Porsche with a problem? Yeah. Jackie had a problem with the GT40, and it was different types of problems, which meant they were absolutely competitive with each other, and we had no idea whether Dunlop was going to win with the Porsche or we were going to win on Firestone with the GT40. And luckily Jackie won, and that night was fantastic. To spend the night in the Hotel de France with the John Wyer team, with Mike Howard, Jackie Oliver, Jackie Ickx, it was fantastic for me. We had the party of parties that night. So it was a fantastic era for me to work with Firestone. And they actually helped me in 1971 when I'd finished in Formula 4. I lost my drive in Formula 4, which is another funny story, which I will tell you if you want me to.
Yeah. I thought it was your great mate's car.
I was driving for somebody else.
By that stage.
At that stage. I started a very, very good friend of mine who I'd met through Firestone called Sheridan Thin. And Sheridan's nephew, Richard Cardew, was driving a Titan Mark IV Formula Ford and not doing very well. And I'm not sure where the aggravation came, but Sheridan took the car off him. And he had seen me race, and bless him, he offered me the car for 1971 with a trailer, as long as I gave it back to him in the same condition at the end of the 1971 season. I didn't have any money. So I went into the PR department of Firestone and said, I have this car and a trailer. Could I get sponsorship from Firestone on it? And he looked at me and laughed and said, no, you can't. But I have an idea. There was a company Firestone was supplying overalls, jackets to all these teams, Ferrari, JW, Surtees, and they were made by a company called Skyjump. And he said, I'm just about to put the biggest order ever into Skyjump. They will not get the order unless they sponsor you in the Formula Ford. So I ran Skyjump on the side of my Formula Ford. They gave me £500, which at that time in 1971 was great. And I did the European Formula Ford Championship for £500.
Is that sort of one? Was it who sponsored it now?
It was Johnson's Wax.
Johnson's Wax.
Johnson's Wax, yeah. So I went down to Paul Ricard for the first ever race meeting they had at Paul Ricard. And Chrissy, my wife, and I stayed in a tent in the paddock, and I'd borrowed Pete Lovely's Volkswagen Transporter that he used to take the Formula One Lotus 49. Yeah. He used to drive that around Europe. He very kindly said, if you ever want to use it, just use it. So I used that. I had so much fun, I can't tell you. Absolutely brilliant. But how I lost the Formula 4 drive was slightly before John Cavell. A guy called Bob Jarvis and Pat Longhurst had several Vixen VB1.
And later they were multiple winners here in Davrians.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, they had a spare one and they offered it to me. And I wanted to progress as a racing driver, and I was unbelievably competitive. Not particularly talented, but very, very competitive. And Bob Jarvis was very quick. And he and I basically had some incredible races against each other.
He was a car trader from Lordship Lane, wasn't he?
Lordship Lane in Dulwich, yes. And we went to Ingliston, and they didn't pay
Fair
anything.
trek from London.
Yes. So I drove up to Ingliston with the Vixen on the back, and it rained. And I've always loved racing in the rain. For some reason, I'm quite competitive in the wet. And Bob Jarvis was leading. Last lap into the right hand at Ingliston. There was prize money, which was fairly rare in Formula 4 in those days.
Well, the Scots were giving out prize money.
I love
Only,
the,
but
I
not
love
to
the,
the,
I
but
do
not
love
to the
Scots.
Sassenachs.
When I drove for Ecuria Cross eventually, I was called McWild, so I do feel slightly Scottish. We came into the last corner and I thought, I've got to win this because there's so much more money to win than second place. Totally forgetting that Bob owned the car I was driving. So I just, unfortunately, totally out of my control, I just happened to tap the back of his offside rear wheel, which put him sideways and let me go through on the inside and win the race. I was absolutely ecstatic until I sort of on the slowing down thought, maybe I really shouldn't have done that. And so when I got back into the paddock, I'd lost my drive.
Oh dear, he was less than gruntled and 400 miles from home.
That's winning the battle and losing the war, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, I was very silly. So that's when, bless him, John Cavell started letting me drive
Right.
his Formula 4.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, the jump then from into the Formula 3 cars at the early 70s was kind of the next big move for you, wasn't it?
It was, and again, John Cavell was very, very instrumental in that happening, in that we were racing Formula 4 at Mallory Park. There's this wonderful corner called Gerrard's, and I think I'd put my car on pole position. And John came up after practice and said, I'm not really going fast enough, Mike. Can you give me some advice? And I said, certainly, how can I help? And he said, well, can you, for instance, this very fast corner at Gerrard's, where are you braking and changing down? And I looked at him and said, John, it's absolutely flat in top gear. You don't brake, you don't change down. It's absolutely flat because, bless them, they didn't have 100 horsepower. And so you could just go flat out all the way around apart from the hairpin. And he looked at me and he said, really? And he wandered off with a sort of a quizzical look to his father and very kindly said to his father, Dad, I don't think I'm going to be a racing driver. How about next year, because this was around 1970, 71, how about we buy Mike at Formula 3 instead of me? And bless his heart, he gave up his driving to allow me to drive his father's Formula 3.
Huh.
Wow.
So you started off with the 713 March, which was
Yes, the ex-James Hunt,
car,
Rose
yeah.
Bearing car, yeah. And I think my first ever Formula 3 race was here at Thruxton, which is probably why I love it so much. I had a mega race against lots of works, March drivers and so on, and I had this little space frame 713. It wasn't the most competitive car, but the race went so well that John Cavell's father, Jack, bless his heart, decided we ought to get a more modern car, and he bought me a new Ensign LNF3.
And I recall, I mean, the Monon Ensigns were pretty decent cars, but
They were.
by the time you came into 73, everyone really had to have the March, didn't they? The GRD had been very good the previous year, but
Yes.
the March suddenly, I guess the March in 72 wasn't that clever. In 73 they revised the aero and the tub and everything. It was much better.
A wonderful little car. We persevered until, for the first few races with the Ensign, it was a wonderful, wonderful racing car. Far too stiff. It would have made a very good Formula 2 car, in my view, because at Monaco, for instance, Colin Bennett and I were cutting parts of the engine bay chassis tubes out to try and get the car to flex, because we were all running fairly small control tyres, the Firestone control tyres, but
And you had
the
probably
chassis,
110 horsepower or something.
yeah, but the chassis was asking the tyres to do too much. the chassis needed to flex a little more. So by this time, I'd found Dempster Developments, because I had the car, the transporter and so on, but no running costs. So Dempster Developments, bless them, started a division, and I worked for them. I left Firestone, which was a big jump for me to leave a very, very good job. But I was absolutely determined to be a professional racing driver.
This is your big chance.
It was.
Yeah.
And that came about really because a man called Jeremy Sumner, I was still going around begging drives from whoever I could. He let me drive his Chevron B6.
This is a really, really bizarre thing. Only yesterday evening I was mentioning Jeremy, Jeromy,
Yes.
Sumner,
Yes.
and his Chevrons
Yes.
over dinner.
He's a wonderful man. And he said, no. He was a friend of mine. And they said, oh, Mike, he's a good racing driver. You'd love to have a drive in your Chevron. No chance. And I kept on badgering poor Jeremy. And eventually he said, okay, well, I'm going to do the GT race at Brands Hatch. I'll let you do the Formula Libre race. You stand no chance because it's all single-seaters. You'll be the only GT car. But if you want to drive it, you can drive it. But if you bend it, you've got to put it right. I mean, I had no money to spend. I'd married Chrissy by this time and trying to find somewhere to live, and I had no money to put to motor racing at all. So I drove it in the Royal Tunbridge Wells Trophy Formula Libre race at Brands Hatch, and it rained. It was wonderful, and I won this Formula Libre race in this lovely little car. And in fact, the only time I've ever raced a Chevron B6 or B8. And he said, I've got to help you. And he introduced me to a man called Colin Phillips and his partner, Sid Pierce. They said, meet us at the Hilton in London. I went up to London. They said, work out a budget. I worked out a budget for Formula 3. We met and they said, okay, but if we do this, we're going to give you a lot of money. You have to put 100% of your time in to driving. So I asked my wife, she was happy with it, and I left Firestone.
Thruxton Motorsport Centre, home to premium driving experiences, where 4 laps in a supercar or single-seater racing car means nearly 10 miles at speeds of over 100 miles an hour around Britain's fastest motor racing circuit. It's an experience that few others can offer. You can even have a 140-mile-an-hour passenger ride in a BMW M4. Thruxton Motorsport Centre, home to premium driving experiences.
Visit thruxtonracing.co.uk to book your premium driving experience.
I look forward to seeing you here.
Well, we're here at Thruxton with Mike Wilds, and to celebrate his birthday, we're going to open a couple of bottles of this wonderful Silverstone Brewery ale. Silverstone Real Ale Company. You've got Checkered Flag, Ignition, Octane, Pit Stop. Your choice, birthday boy. I guess it's obvious, isn't it?
Yes, I'd like all of them, please.
Could be right.
Yes, it's got to be the Checkered Flag. I like to get to the Checkered Flag first. I worked at the Checkered Flag, so if I may.
Indeed.
So the Checkered Flag is the one that gets opened and poured for birthday boy Mike Wilds, and that we're going to work our way through this lot. It's going to be a long job, isn't it?
It's tough, but somebody has to do it.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
It is your birthday, Mike. So
cheers.
Cheers.
What are you going to sample, Mr. Tarsi Senior?
I think probably I shall go for let's have a look. Octane. I think. Please,
Octane. High
Marcus.
octane, low octane, octane booster.
Yeah. Just
Can I say
low
it
octane,
is very nice. It's very nice.
And, we were talking earlier on when these arrived, weren't we, and saying that it's initially perhaps slightly disappointing that they haven't got something called maggots, but on
Understandable,
consideration,
yes,
perhaps
understandable.
it's not the best thing.
Exactly. Well, how splendid this is. I might just have a little sip of your special octane brew in my glass, not from Paul's.
Yep.
That's fine. We'll give it a go.
Be assured.
Happy birthday, Mike.
Your good health.
Happy birthday, Mike.
Many thanks.
Be assured, listeners, that we do all have our drivers taking us home. So that's an important part of what it's all about.
Exactly true. So we've got Mike, as a Formula 3 fully fledged kind of full-time racing driver at last, after
Yes.
kind of 8 years or something like that.
Yes, the first step of my ambition achieved. My ambition was obviously to try and get to Formula One. I had no idea whether I had the talent to do it. As soon as I got the March 733, though, I did then start to have a few wins in Formula 3. And I have to say, Formula 3 at that time was very competitive. I remember going to Silverstone. I think I finished second to Alan Jones, had a wonderful dice with Alan. My first race in the 733. And we had to qualify through heats to get into a final. We had to qualify in practice to get into a heat. There was probably 100 Formula 3 cars there. And you had the Jacques Lafitte's and, as I say, Alan Jones and the Ian Taylors of this world. Bless him. I always think of Ian when I'm here at Thruxton. A very good friend of mine. So it was a very competitive era, and it was nice to win, even though I probably only won 2 or 3 races. It was nice to win the last Formula 3 race at Croft on the old circuit and get the lap record that day.
Down the old railway straight.
Yes, I was determined to win because I was being pressed by the wonderful Ian Taylor and Tony Bryce.
Yeah.
And I was determined to win because the day before we'd been at Alton Park and Ian had blown his engine. So the team very kindly lent my spare engine to Ian, and I was not going to get beaten by my own engine.
But the Dempster, the Dirty Dempster, as it was kind of known, Dirty Dempster was a sort of a cartoon character, kind of was a caped crusader, wasn't he?
Yes, the dirty bit came from Dempster International Racing Team. Well, he can't be Dirt Dempster, he's got to be Dirty Dempster. And I had a moustache and a beard at the time, and they designed this little superhero character with a crash helmet and goggles on, and supposedly was me. It didn't look anything like me at all.
But the car was it was very memorable, sort of bright red with the yellow flashes on it. It did look $1 million, and those 6-spoke March wheels always looked mint on those.
Yes, and Colin Bennett, bless his heart, the preparation was second to none. You could eat your dinner off that car. It was beautifully prepared.
Amazing thing. And yes, I remember seeing you race that car a couple of times. And you took Dempster with you into the 5000, didn't you?
Yes,
interesting story.
Yes, we were so lucky to have enough money to do 3 championships. I did the John Player European Formula 3 Championship, the Forward Trust British Formula Championship, the Lombard North Central. I probably did 100 races that year.
But they were kind of one-day meetings, weren't they?
Yes,
By and large.
yes.
There were some weekends.
And you went from one to the, like we did Alton Park on the Saturday, Croft on the Sunday, and so on. But the problem was we did too much, and I should have concentrated on the European Championship or the European Championship and 1 British Championship. But to do 3 championships in the 1 year, I finished 3rd in 1 of the British Championships. I think it was the Lombard North Central. And I finished 6th in the European Championship, which sounds dreadful, but it was, with the Works Alpines and Martinis, it was an unbelievably competitive season.
It was the last year of the 1600 Formula 3, wasn't it?
That's right. And it was fantastic, but we did too much, and I really wanted to progress my career would be to go to European Formula 2. And I was desperate to go to Formula 2. And so very kindly Dempster said, well, let's put the budget together and so on. And I put the budget together and I listed the races, and they said, but there's only 2 in England. And their company was in the UK. And they said, no, we're not going to do Formula 2. You have to come up with something else. So Formula 5000 seemed the next logical step for me to try and achieve this incredibly burning ambition to drive in Formula 1. So I said that we should get a Lola T332 with an Alan Smith crossover fuel-injected engine, and I'm sure that we'll be competitive in the European Formula 5000 Championship. Sadly, Max Mosley of March Engineering they were very kind. They did offer me my first ever Formula One race. They were very, very kind to us, but
I think they were probably courting the big money for the following year,
yes,
weren't they?
yes. They persuaded Dempster that they should buy a new Formula One March, a 741, but instead of putting a DFV in it, we put a 5-litre Alan Smith Chevrolet engine in the back. Well, the only engine we could get was on carburetors at that time. So we fitted this big V8 in the back of this Formula One car. We borrowed...
There wasn't much of the car there, was there, when you turned up at the factory the first time?
No, I don't.
It was conspicuous by its absence.
Yes. But eventually we managed to get a chassis, and we took it to Brian Lewis's down at Chobham Airfield.
Mm-hmm.
And we fitted, Colin did all the fabrication and so on to fit this V8 in Chevrolet in the back. And I shall never forget going to Silverstone for the first time, having raced 120 horsepower Formula 3, to suddenly have 500 of grunty Chevrolet in the back of a single-seater. And luckily, the car worked reasonably well. And I did manage to get pole position once in front of the all-conquering Chevron B24s of Teddy Pillett and Peter Gethin. I did get pole position once. And I finished second in the first race to Peter Gethin, and had a magnificent dice with one of my all-time heroes, Brian Redmond. Brian was in a Lola 332, and I just kept overtaking him and doing stupid lunges and so on. And I learnt so much from Brian on the Grand Prix circuit at Brands Hatch of how you should drive a Formula 5000, not how I was driving it. But I did beat him. Peter came first, I came second, Brian was third. And that gave me a lot of confidence that in my first 5000 race, I could actually mix it with these guys who were my heroes, really.
Absolutely brilliant. Really fascinating stuff. And we've got James Cameron with us, who's dropped in.
Good morning.
Hello,
Good morning, James.
Hi, Mike. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
You've been
Cheers.
busy.
I brought tea, but I'm feeling like I've done really badly.
What would you like?
Do you know, I've got a long drive. I'm going to finish my tea, if I may. But they look fantastic.
They are after good. Why don't you take a couple with you or something like that? It'd be a good idea, wouldn't
Thank you
it?
very much.
And you're here doing something in the paddock at Thruxton, which is fascinating.
We are, yeah. So we've been doing a bunch of training here, both before and after Christmas. Both here and on the skid pan. Of course, Thruxton's got this fantastic skid pan facility now, which was added a couple of years ago. And we're training up a team of guys and girls who are going to be doing a precision driving display in the live action arena at Autosport
So
later
that's
on this week.
Yeah, very, very soon.
Very soon. And, I've sort of been asked the question a couple of times, like, oh, it's all come together, has it, at the last minute? I'm like, it will. I'm fairly certain it will. The couple of days after Christmas is the first time they've moved out of our training fleet, a bunch of Mark 1 MX-5s that serve us really well. And they've suddenly stepped up into about £400,000 worth of mixture of Caterham 270Rs, Morgan three-wheelers, and also the new Plus 6, which is the BMW engined, all aluminium chassis. Only it's not a chassis these days, is it? Just an amazing pieces of kit, which are the new Plus 6s. And they're driving them within inches of each other at speed. But the next stage of complication actually comes tomorrow, because then we add the band of the Irish Guards into it as well. Just to make things challenging.
What are they slaloming through the band of the Irish Guards? Or?
Pretty much, yeah. And driving head on through them while they're marching and playing. So, the Autosport said to us, we'd like you to come. We'd like you to come and do your thing. And we did it 2 years ago, because we just taught Billy Munger to drive again after his accident at Donington. It was only 5 months after the accident that we first got Billy, put him in a car and got him driving initially on hand controls.
Put him in a Fun Cup car, I seem to remember, at Brands Hatch.
He went and I think he went and sort of posed with the car, but didn't do too much with it. But then we did a load of stuff behind the scenes, because Terry Grant came to us and said, look, I've been asked to kind of help Billy, and this is your bread and butter. There's the temptation always in these recovery things is to go and do the really sort of shiny stuff. Actually, the important work happens at the times in between and the times afterwards, and it has to be about the recovery journey of the individual. And you know, Billy at the time just turned 18 years old, you know, so an incredibly young lad. And I think actually it's lovely, and we've got a great relationship with him still. He's in touch with a lot of the blokes because he shared a surgeon with them extraordinarily. So the guy who actually operated on Billy was a serving Lieutenant Colonel doctor who was on placement in, I think it was Nottingham Hospital, where he was operated on. And Billy went from being this unique individual to suddenly being in a room full of people who've all got, you know, things like that. And for whom I think it really helped him just normalise it and realise what was possible.
Sounds like it kind of helped everyone. It's kind of a shared experience. And at Mission Motorsport, I mean, you kind of, we've come to expect you deliver the extraordinary time after time. And you work obviously with some extraordinary brave people, some very committed people, and also some extremely skilled surgeons and trainers and counsellors, everyone else. Mike's had a couple of major accidents we've been hearing about earlier on, and has been kind of very fortunate to still keep your pins.
Yes.
It's always really interesting actually talking to professional sportsmen, because I think what we do can really echo with them, because particularly that end of career moment as well can be a really difficult thing to come to terms with, because you exist in a bubble and a culture and a way of working which is all about what you're absolutely focused on. Mike is, of course, you know, I mean, still amongst it, still very much a part of the scene, you know, and that's fantastic. But for the professional rugby players, for example, the professional footballers, it's a real cliff edge that they fall off, and you lose a sense of what are you, what is your purpose. And ultimately that's what we're doing with these guys and girls. We've got all three services represented. They're from across the country. Some are still serving.
And it's a range of disabilities that they bring to the party, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, but the single biggest thing that we deal with is mental health.
Yeah.
We've never struggled with physical disability to get someone up a flight of stairs. We've never struggled to adapt a vehicle for somebody to be able to do it. So there's a couple of amputees in amongst that team, but they're not driving adapted vehicles. They're driving an auto, and they just happen to be left leg impaired. One of them is missing a left eye, so the bit that he does within the routine, it's not that important what's there. So
I've been on track days with Mercedes when people have announced later on, after they've been off the track, they've only got sight in one eye.
And I work with you on those, I think.
yes, exactly. But do you find that
you can work around it? Yeah, but it's the mental health piece, I think, is the single biggest thing, and it's actually about rebuilding confidence and developing a sense of self. So yes, we're doing autosport, and that will be amazing. It will press loads of buttons. So we had a guy for whom a particular trigger is radios and microphones and things like that. But he's just been interviewed by ITV News.
Perfect.
Because it's out of context, presented to him in a different way. Yeah. And it's fantastic. So we use the motorsport as a tool to be able to unlock recovery goals in people.
But there's a much kind of greater public awareness now, isn't there, of disability within all walks of life, and with the Paralympic thing is so extraordinary these days.
It really is. I mean, I'm back in 2012. I don't know what it was about the London Olympics, but when it came to an end, it almost felt, you know, like a loss, because we'd got so used to this wonderful thing. Yeah. And then it was the Paralympics. It was just fabulous. It's more of the same. And the rise, I think, in Paralympic sports, I think, is really important. But people deal with it in different ways. So things are not seen as a disability. No longer has quite the negative connotations that perhaps it used to. And where we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder is certainly a thing. We talk about post-traumatic growth. It is human to be shaped by the experiences that you've had. It would be inhuman not to have been affected by the things which you've done, but it doesn't necessarily mean to make you worse.
What I know now, and I have daughters of 20, 16 and 14, and we have younger kids come around the house, cousins and things, is that kids miss nothing.
No.
And probably prior to that London Olympics thing, which brought disability in sport so much into the public eye, they were probably a little bit kind of, ooh, that's a bit different, probably shy to talk about these things. Now it's very, very normal. And they can say, look at that, it's extraordinary.
Well, my kids are, because they sort of live with it, so they're just fairly used to, you know, artificial limbs leaning up against the bottom of our stairs at home. And I remember coming downstairs and Holly, who would have been 6 years old, was doing head, shoulders, knees and toes with Davy Birrell, but instead they were doing head, shoulders, knees and wheels. and it's just joyous. But for her, it's natural and normal.
Yeah.
You know, she just doesn't really see an issue in it, and that's amazing.
So you go from here on a Tuesday morning.
Yes.
And when do you transfer to that indoor arena at the
Tomorrow
NEC?
afternoon. So this is us squeezing every last bit out of Thruxton's generosity and the relationship that we have with the Bark to be able to do the very last bit of training. But these couple of days have been them going out of MX-5s into suddenly 340 horsepower things with no traction control of any description. I mean, those Morgans, the +6s are nuts. And then tomorrow lunchtime is the first time they'll drive in the arena.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole sort of escalation series of there as well, because we'll put the band in amongst it. But then there's that moment when the big screens are on, the sound systems are working. It's dark when you drive in there. And I remember
no pressure then.
The first time I did it was I was asked to go and drive a Boxster just to stand in for somebody to do one of the races that they were showcasing. And I remember I did a horrible name drop, but it was just how surreal everything was. Derek Bell was there because he's a patron. And Derek tapped on the window and went, "Good luck, Jim, have a good time." And I could barely fit in this Boxster because the seat wouldn't adjust, and the short arse who normally drove it was clearly a lot shorter in the leg than ours. And I went, "Oh, good God, right, Derek Bell. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Derek." And you go out into the arena, line up, and there's a girl in front of you in Lycra, which rather surprised me because, bloody hell. So I had my 1970s...
The perks of victory await.
My 1970s grid girl moment. And then look sideways into darkness, and then one of the lights goes across it, and you realise it's this sea of faces. There's 5,500 people in there. And you look ahead again, and the girl's gone, and the lights change, and everybody's left. It's like, bloody hell. And you go, you're 6 laps of the arena, and there's no grip, none whatsoever, and you're mixing it up with everybody else. And you come out the other side, and there's a monster truck coming in, and it can't see what's in front of you. And there wasn't enough room, so you're all desperately trying to, you're getting to the point, I'm going to push the car in front of me if it doesn't get out of the way.
I was beginning to think that I'd prefer to be the driver than the bandsman, but now I think actually it might be the bandsman. I could run away and leap over the concrete barrier.
We're just, at some point, we're hoping that one of those Morgans doesn't suddenly contain a guardsman, with a bearskin on and a trombone that wasn't there previously.
Limited edition.
I do have to say that, sorry to interject, that I did drive a Tyrrell, an old Tyrrell Formula One, in that arena once, and driving a Formula One car on ice is not much fun, really.
You haven't done it again, put it that way.
No.
We were helping Billy do it in the Formula 4 last year, and it's a really unusual surface. But then there's also the cable lays underneath as well, so there's sort of wooden bits that are in there too, so the whole thing clunks as you drive across it. When you see the drifters and the precision with which they can go right against the outside, it's incredible.
Impressive.
Yeah, I mean, and for the people who are in there, as a way in January to get close to this huge spectrum of motorsport, it is incredible. It's really cool. And to use the excitement of all of that, I just remember, I finally got out of the way of this monster truck that came past me. And I could hear this, and I thought, oh God, something's wrong with the car. And I looked down, and it was my left leg just with adrenaline was going like hell, and I'd got disco leg. And it was 3 minutes from start to finish, from Derek Bell to disco leg was 3 minutes, and my pulse must have been, 180 something.
And then you auditioned for Strictly.
Yeah, and then you straight out the other side. Oh my God. We did the Brit car into the night race at Brands Hatch, and it does me such huge credit. I think I've got that on my CV somewhere, but
I have
thanks
too.
very much.
I was Mike's teammate at Silverstone.
All the finest
Master
people,
MX RX-8s.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, that's just the best way to do things, isn't
Good
it?
old
Graham
Mazda.
Fudge has got a lot to answer for, hasn't
Yes.
he? Thank you very
Brilliant.
much, Marcus.
A great pleasure. Okay, so Mike, we've talked about your Formula 5,000 days. Then you've got the big call, the Louis Stanley call for potential works driver at BRM?
Yes, it came about because I was struggling with Mo Nunn's MN174, I think it was, DFV. And I hadn't qualified in Italy, I hadn't qualified in Austria, and we got to North America, and it was getting to be a big issue. Every time I tried to turn the ensign to the left, it lost fuel pressure. And Formula One was very, very, as it always is, was very, very competitive, and there were 30 cars for 25 places on the grid, and I wasn't getting there. So bless his heart, Canada was the final nail in the coffin, really. I was getting very depressed about it all, and he said, right, between Canada and Watkins Glen, the American, I'm going to redesign the whole fuel system. Which he did, bless his heart. He got stuff made, and we ran different collector pots and all sorts of things. And I got to Watkins Glen and I qualified because I had fuel pressure everywhere, which was fantastic for the first time. And I qualified 22nd out of 30. And there were people like Tim Schenken in the works, Lotus, Brambilla in the works, March, Hans Stuck in the other works, March, didn't qualify. So I was chuffed to bits, absolutely chuffed to bits, to be sitting on the grid of a Grand Prix for the first time. And it seemed with the ensign that fuel system was always going to bug me, because as I came round for the start and sat on the grid and built the revs up, again the man lifted the Union Jack, and as he dropped it, my fuel pressure went from 120 pounds to 40. And I struggled to get the car around one lap to get it back in the pit lane. They actually sent Tim Schenken out as he was first reserve. They sent him out into the race. But we had to change, the fuel pressure relief valve had gone. So Mo changed it, took, 6 or 7 laps. So I wasn't going to be classified. But Mo said, just go out and enjoy the race. So I went out, and much to Tim Schenken's chagrin, he got pulled off because I carried on in the race. But during that race, that lovely man Chris Amon was driving a BRM P201, and just for fun, I was around the same as I came out of the pits. I joined up with Chris Amon. We had a wonderful dice for the rest of the race. And after the race, a portly gentleman came up to me and said, I don't know who you are, but do you have a drive for next year? So I said no. He said, would you like to come and talk to me at the Dorchester? So this was obviously Louis Stanley, and I was chuffed to bits that somebody wanted to come and talk to me about driving a Formula One car for the following year.
Had you been impressed by Jody Scheckter's comments about you driving the previous car?
Oh my God, yes. Should I tell the story?
I think you should.
Okay. I had a bit of a eureka moment. I was trying to drive the ensign as hard as I could, and I wanted to be further up the grid. And I wasn't sure I was going to qualify. And I had suddenly this eureka moment. I was sitting in the pit lane. Mo was putting some more tyres on the car. And I was looking down the pit lane and saw a grandstand on the left-hand side of the first right-hander before the very fast S's. And I thought, that'd be a great place to watch the motor race. And I suddenly realised what mindset I was in. I'd not qualified in the previous 3 Grand Prix. I was already in that mindset that I wasn't going to be in this Grand Prix, and it really fired me up. And I went out, did a warm-up lap on the new tyres, and started a qualifying lap to look in the mirrors and see Jody Scheckter behind me with the Works Tyrrell. And I was determined. This was my lap. And I went absolutely flat through the S's. It was a good lap. Okay, the lap was 2 seconds off pole, but for me, it was a really good lap. And every time I came out of a corner, I looked in the mirror, and there was Jody Scheckter in the Tyrrell, about a foot behind me. And I went to have a shower afterwards, absolutely elated that I'd got on the grid of a Grand Prix. Came out of the shower, was walking back to the pit garages. Ken Tyrrell came up to me and said, "Oh, Mike, Jodie's looking for you." Now, Jodie had a bit of a reputation. There was a book out at the time, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was called Jonathan Livingston's Seagull, and it was about a colony of seagulls, and one of the seagulls in this colony was a very aggressive seagull, and he was called Fletcher. And not to his face, but if somebody was looking for Jodie, they'd say, "Oh, have you seen Fletcher anywhere?" And so on and so forth. So I thought, right, I've qualified for this Grand Prix on merit. I'm sure Jodie would say, "Why the hell didn't you get out of the way?" You know, I was trying to do a qualifying lap or whatever. But I was absolutely on my maximum, and I wasn't going to back off for anybody. So I found Jodie. He was talking to somebody, and I waited very politely, building this, I'm not going to be shouted at by, you know, I deserve to be on this grid. So I got my finger ready, and when Jodie had finished talking to this gentleman, I walked up to him and I prodded him with my finger in his chest. "Are you looking for me?" Very aggressively. I wasn't going to take any shit from Jodie Scheckter. And he looked a bit aghast. And he just looked at me and said, "Wow, I just wanted to tell you how well you were making that shit ensign go." So I've heard about half an inch tall. But I don't think that had anything to do with Louis Stanley talking to me. But I eventually did go to the Dorchester to have a meeting with Louis Stanley.
Was it watercress sandwiches and gentleman's relish?
It was. I mean, I couldn't believe that this man had a suite in the Dorchester 24/7. Yeah. Whether he was there or not, that was his suite, supposedly. I don't know if it was true, but that's what he told me. And it was like pulling teeth, basically. You know, I wanted to be a Formula One driver. Before I went to the meeting at the Dorchester, I'd gone to St George's Hospital to see my good friend Mike Howard, who'd broken his leg at Nürburgring, I think, in the McLaren. And he said, "Whatever you do not want to drive a BRM next year." And I said, "Mate, I have nothing. So eventually we got to the meeting. I wanted to be paid. He didn't want to pay me. He didn't want to. I said, "Well, I want £500 per championship point." And we were going through all this, and he came up with his list. You're not allowed to ride motorbikes. You're not allowed to go water skiing. You're not allowed to live. And I said, "I have to go away and think about it." So I went away. We didn't do a deal. I went back for another meeting. We went through the whole thing again. And it came to the finale, really, where I was either going to sign a contract with BRM or I wasn't. And I had nothing else. I'd done a little bit of testing for John Surtees, but he couldn't give me a drive because he was going to have French money for...
Jussel or someone like that?
No, Henri Pescarolo.
Pescarolo, yeah.
Now, I tested with Henri at Goodwood, and I've still got the cutting at home. I was 2 seconds a lap faster than Henri Pescarolo at Goodwood, and yet Henri had a suitcase full of money, so he got the drive. John said, "I'm sorry, you're quicker, but I have to take the money," which I understand. So I thought, I'm going to be on the shelf here. So I signed, but he would only pay me £1 to make the contract binding. So he paid me £1 and said, "You've got to find your own wages." Fine. So I signed the contract, went to Snetterton to test the car with Chris Amon. And Chris went out in the P201. They wouldn't let me drive the P201. They put me in a P160, which was wonderful. The most lovely racing car to drive. And so I went round and round most of the day in the P160 having a ball, going reasonably quickly. And right at the end of the day, Chris had to go. They said, right, you can do a few laps in the P201. At about the end of the second or third lap, I accelerated around Corham, through Russell, out past the pit lane, and it put 2 rods out of the side of the engine. And it was under power. I was probably doing about 10 or 11,000 revs, and we were using about 12,000 in the 3 litre then. And it was amazing. They said, oh, don't worry about that. You know, I thought, this is Formula One. I don't have to worry about engine blow-ups. This is brilliant. So we went to Argentina for the first race on my birthday, today, in 1975. January the 7th, we flew to Buenos Aires. I travelled out with Mike Hailwood and Susie Hunt, who sat next to me all that way, which was really quite pleasant. And I notice things. I look at the racing cars I'm going to drive because I'm interested. I want to understand what's going on. I look at the engine, the suspension, everything. I like to get involved. When I got to Argentina, I did my usual. I looked round the car and everything. I looked at this engine, and it was the engine that I'd blown up at Snetterton with the block welded up. And I thought, this really isn't very good news. I'm no engineer. I'm a racing driver. I've never been a mechanic. But I know if you've got something that's singing at about 12,000 RPM and the block isn't original, it's welded up, it doesn't bode well. And so it transpired. I didn't finish any of the practice sessions in Argentina, didn't finish the race. Same thing happened in Brazil. And I came home from that few weeks in South America really annoyed because I was trying my best. I did drive my heart out in the car and just failed all the time. So when I got back, I had a meeting with Louis Stanley. He said, well, you know, you're not doing very well and so on. And I exploded and said that basically the engines just were not up to scratch anymore. He should go to Cosworth, get a DFV, put it in the back. The chassis of the 201 was great, apart from frying my ankles with the inboard front disc brakes. It was a really good car. You put a DFV in the back, get a bit of reliability, we could be certainly in the middle of the grid. He fired me on the spot.
That was always the problem, wasn't it? I mean, the Stanley Steamer was always sort of hobbled by these not very good and furthermore not very consistent engines.
That's right. I mean, the engines were, in their day, were very good, and they got results in Formula One. But we're now talking several years down the line, and Formula One moves on. And yes, Ferrari had very good 3-litre V12s. BRM were using old 3-litre V12s. And the Cosworth was 99% of the grid. It was only Ferrari and BRM that were using anything else.
So was it that Louis Stanley just had this belief that everything BRM was wonderful? Or was there some other reason?
Oh yes, it was partly that, but it was also the fact that I had the audacity to suggest that he put in his words, an American engine in a BRM. And I said, Louis, it's Keith Duckworth, Mike Costin, Northampton, the company is Cosworth. He said, yes, but the money behind it is Ford, it's American, therefore it's an American engine. It will never, ever go in a BRM. And as I say, I got fired on the spot. It didn't cost me a lot of money because it was only £1 for the contract. I mean, I was very lucky in that I managed to get a sponsor for my wages. Otherwise, I really, I couldn't have done it in the first place. But
did you have a conversation with Mike Hailwood?
Yes, he always took the piss out of me, basically. But that was the end of my Formula One career. I couldn't get back in. I did do some testing with Mike and Surtees for a while, but sadly, that was the last time I drove in a Grand Prix. A great shame. I probably wasn't ever good enough, but I would have loved the chance to have driven a BT44 Brabham or an M23 McLaren or a Lotus 72, just to see if I did have the wherewithal to be a reasonable Formula One driver. And
You've driven a 72 since, haven't you?
I have, yes. My hero, Ronnie Peterson's. I sat on that was very surreal, to sit on the grid before the start, before I had these fuel pressure problems again with the ensign. Ronnie Peterson, who I always thought was an amazing racing driver and a lovely man, he was in chassis number 6, Lotus 72, chassis number 6, that he'd won Monaco in 1974. And he was just in front of me on the grid in the American Grand Prix. And how cool is that you sit there and look at your hero in a Lotus 72. It was like a dream for me. And I managed, when Katsu Kubota bought it, he didn't want to come to the UK to see if the car was okay. He asked Colin Bennett, who was looking after it, who could he trust to drive the car on his behalf to see if it was okay. And bless his heart, Colin telephoned me. And Autosport very kindly did a little article on it, which is in pride of place on my office wall, framed. It was very emotional to drive Ronnie's car.
And you've driven a lot of what were then current Formula One cars since, haven't you?
I have, yes. I drove for Don Wood with my good friend Pat Blakeney. Did some thoroughbred Grand Prix races, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I very sadly had a very bad accident in Nick Mason's Villeneuve 312 T3, which broke both my legs and put me in a wheelchair for many, many months. But I have been for a fairly average racing driver, I have been absolutely privileged that people will let me drive their racing cars, and I've been lucky enough to drive not as many as my good friend Marcus, but I've driven a lot of lovely, lovely racing cars.
But you're the consummate pro. You've been doing these things. The Formula One thing didn't go well, but you won the British Formula 2 Championship within the Aurora with Graham Eden's Rolt, and you've driven some Can-Am cars. You've driven had a great era of Le Mans with Akira Kos. I mean, didn't have much to show for your Le Mans results really in the end, did you? But
no,
some very interesting days with Akira Kos in those World Championship C2 cars.
Group C was, in my opinion, just the best. I had the most fun. I did 4 years with the Kyriakos, hence my name McWilds. Ray McMalloch, very kindly telephoned me when the team was being put together and asked me to join. And we did our first race, the Monza 1000 Ks in 1984, and I stayed with the team until 1987, and luckily to be part of such a wonderful team of people. Ray, I have the utmost respect for as a designer, as a racing driver. Very privileged to call him a friend. To race with him was fantastic, with the great, sadly missed David Leslie. With, in a few races, David Duffield from Scotland, and then eventually with Marc Douay from Belgium.
There was a classic thing, wasn't there, at Spa when the car got well stuffed in practice, one of the Ecosses.
Yes, that was me.
Tell us about that, because I think George Fowles was really wound up by Ray Bellm, wasn't he?
Yes.
Who was driving the rival Spice.
Yes. It was deemed, I was going to do the start of the race, and it was deemed that I would do the morning warm-up, which was normal. I didn't see anything wrong with Eau Rouge when I approached it, and in a Group C car, even a Group C2 car, you are travelling quite quickly. And I got to the left-hand apex at the top of Radillon to find oil, and it was just like hitting a little bit of ice. And I went straight across the road and hit the wall on the outside very, very hard. And the car, I thought, was finished. But George and the team of mechanics were absolutely amazing. They rebuilt the car between warm-up and the start of the race.
Primarily because Ray Bellman turned around and said, well, that's our opposition out of the race then.
Yeah, that's right. And I was quite badly hurt. I'd certainly hurt my neck. And but I was determined if they finished the car, I was going to drive. But Marc Douay, he was a Belgian hero in rallying and so on and so forth, a fantastic guy who I got on with really well. Got some amazing stories of us racing in Japan and so on, which I daren't tell now. But he said he would do the start and do a nice long stint to give my neck enough time to try and recover. And then I would do a stint and he would drive the maximum that he could to help me out, which was great. And sadly, I can't remember the result we got, but we certainly got some points for the World Championship out of that race. It was a wonderful bubble to be within. Hugh McCaig
had patron.
Yeah, he was or is such a lovely guy. We partied, we had so much fun, but the motor racing was incredibly serious, and they were so kind to me.
It's kind of almost like a parallel with Lord Hesketh, but
yes.
I think McCaig was more focused on results as well as party.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he used to give me a really hard time. If you didn't do the job, he gave you a hard time, which was fair enough. And when, after that Spa incident, Ray and I won the class at the 1,000 Ks at Brands Hatch, and it was lovely because I'd felt down about crashing the car at Spa and so on, but they put me on their shoulders and carried me down the pit lane to the podium, and that was one of the best moments for me.
But I think what's been brilliant, apart from these frontline races you've done, that passion you talked about initially when you had the DRW and the Vixens and bits and pieces has always shone through. You still have it.
Yeah,
and
I still have it.
You've driven old Super Saloons, you've driven the DAF, which has just changed hands.
Yep.
And you drove the XJ8 Chevrolet Jaguar, which was extraordinary, where you shared the cockpit with the engine. It sort of pretty much sat alongside you.
Yes, it's crazy, really, isn't it?
Very strange.
Crazy.
I always question you about that.
It was very noisy, very hot, and probably very dangerous. But
and Aston Martin's, thoroughbred sports car champion with a DB4.
Yes, what wonderful! I remember driving it here, the DB4. I think it was on opposite lock the whole way round, and I won the race with the biggest smile on my face that I could have. And it was lovely when you read things in the magazines on a Thursday. We all have egos, I suppose. I pick up Autosport. Did they write about me winning that race? And it says, star of the race was Mike Wiles on opposite lock all the way around. And it's great that people appreciate it. One of my great memories of Marcus is it was a nothing race. I was driving a Chevron at Silverstone. And
I was probably in it as well, because that's why it was a nothing
race. You were actually standing at Cops, and you very kindly came up to me after it was probably qualifying, and said something about, "I just love your commitment." And it was a big compliment to me that somebody like
was
Marcus...
one of those Chevrons. I think it was one of Richard Budge's Chevrons.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And
I'd not leapt backwards off an apex of a corner so vehemently since Keke Rosberg attacked Paddock Bend in a Williams Formula One car with a turbo of a full blast.
That'll do it.
But it means a lot when your peers say that you're driving well.
I think what it is you go to those things, and it's like as a racer watches a rally driver. I think some rally drivers can race very, very well.
Very well. Yeah.
Most race drivers wouldn't want to rally as well as the rally drivers race. And you stand there, and there are days, there are many days when you see something extraordinary happen on the track, but there are days like with Mike and the Chevron there, or with Rosberg, or with Peterson, who was my big hero as well, or Brian Redman, or something like that. you look at those things and you think to yourself, I've driven lots of racing cars and I've had a little bit of success in club racing, but do you know, I couldn't do that ever. I could never be that good to be able to do that, to wring that out of a car. And so you do appreciate what you see because it's extraordinary.
I think probably for me, as somebody who has driven very, very few race cars, that it's a similar kind of thing but slightly different, because you two know where you sit in the pecking order. I think I know where I sit in the pecking order, which probably is far, far higher than actually I do. But it's the same thing, that as a punter, I can actually stand and look at somebody out on the racetrack and say, yeah, that is a good moment. And I think probably all of us have been in that situation where you just think, I mean, it's a bit like the perfect crisp winter morning where you just walk out and go, oh, this is great.
Yes.
And this is the same thing where you think, yeah, that's quite something. I can remember seeing, Keke Rosberg in the Williams round the old Woodcut, and you think,
and Ronnie,
Ronnie,
same
awesome
thing.
In those, wasn't he?
And you think that this is actually just a special moment.
Yes.
And you're still having your special moments in all sorts of cars. What are you racing these days?
I am. This year I'm very lucky. I'm doing the Peter Auto Group C series.
Right.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I had a run in Mario Andretti's ex-Kenwood Porsche 956, which came third at Le Mans in '83. A gentleman has bought it. Rainer Becker has bought it. Luckily, the man who looks after it, my good friend Trevor Crisp, said, look, Rainer, you haven't raced anything like this.
You need a pro.
You need to talk to somebody about it. So I thought I was going to do some coaching with Rainer. We had a meeting at one of his restaurants in London, and he very kindly asked me to race it. And
so you get to race cars and eat nicely too?
Absolutely.
Can't be bad.
Yes.
Sure.
So I'm racing that in that series, and he also said that he gets a bit tired in his lovely 3-litre 911 RSR.
I saw that in a workshop recently
Yes,
at Andy Prill's place.
Yes.
Wonderful.
So he's asked me to race that. So I'm utterly blessed for, as I say, a racing driver with a modicum of talent. I've had, this will be my 55th season. I can't tell you how much I still love it, and I'm so excited to be able to do it this year. I never thought in 1965 I'd still be doing it when I was 74.
Exactly. Well, you'll still be doing it long after you're 75, I'm sure. So
That's
the next landmark. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege,
Thank
Mike
you very
Wiles,
much.
to have you in the Thruxton studio today, and wish you a fantastic season, and we'll see you somewhere along the way.
Thank you for your hospitality. Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you, Mike.